Human waited beside an alien girl until the storm cleared. Her dawn gesture became his anchor. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to the story. The storm howled relentlessly, biting at the skin of anyone brave enough to venture outside. The snowflakes danced like tiny ice crystals in the air, whipping across the barren landscape with ruthless intensity. Amidst the swirling chaos of the blizzard, a lone figure huddled beneath a rocky overhang, his breath misting in the frigid air. David, a simple man from Earth, stood vigil next to a wounded alien girl, her pale blue skin nearly blending into the snow. She had collapsed after the violent storm forced her into the unforgiving wilderness. The icy wind tore through David's jacket, but he stood firm, his eyes never leaving the girl's fragile form. He had no idea where she came from or what brought her to this desolate place, but there was something in her that made him stay. His fingers ached as he clasped them tighter around his coat, trying to keep warm. But it was the girl that kept him from leaving. Her small, delicate face, framed by silver hair that shimmered in the faint light, was pale with exhaustion. Her breathing was shallow, labored, but she was still alive. For now, David glanced up at the sky, hoping the storm would soon pass. The winds seemed to intensify, their howls deafening, but he couldn't abandon her. He had seen too much suffering in his own life to leave someone behind. He had been stranded in this alien world, with no way of knowing what to expect. Yet, here he was, a stranger to her kind, watching over her as if she were his own. The night stretched on, and David barely moved, his body freezing, his thoughts only on the girl beside him. The storm raged, but as the hours wore on, something began to shift. A quiet calm settled over them. The winds slowly faded, the snowflakes becoming lighter, less intense. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight glistened across the snow-covered ground, casting a soft golden glow on the girl's face. David's heart skipped a beat as he noticed the subtle change in her expression. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing the striking golden irises that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. She gazed at him for a moment, and for the first time, David saw something more than pain in her eyes. There was a flicker of understanding, of gratitude. She raised her hand, trembling slightly, but there was a clear intent behind the motion. Slowly, she reached out and touched his arm, a small gesture that spoke volumes. In that moment, everything changed. David's heart swelled with an emotion he couldn't name. The storm had cleared, and with it, something else had blossomed between them. It was as though the world had shifted, bringing them closer in ways he had never expected. The girl, despite her alien origins, had become his anchor in this foreign place. And as the sun rose higher, David knew that their journey together was just beginning. As the first light of dawn bathed the frozen landscape, David remained still, his eyes locked on the alien girl beside him. Nissa's breath was steady now, no longer rattling in her chest. The tension that had gripped him for hours seemed to loosen, though the cold still gnawed at him. Her small hand rested against his arm, her touch a quiet acknowledgement of the bond they were forming. He glanced at the storm's fading remnants, the wind now only a soft whisper, the snowflakes that had once pelted the world around them now dancing lazily in the air. David shifted slightly, careful not to disturb Nissa, but the warmth of the morning sun began to reach him, offering a brief reprieve from the harsh cold. As the light grew stronger, David finally allowed himself a moment to breathe, releasing a long sigh he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He had no idea how long they would stay in this strange, hostile environment. But one thing was clear, they were no longer just strangers. A fragile sense of trust had begun to form between them. Nissa shifted, her eyes still half-lidded, but now she was more aware, her movements more deliberate as she began to rise slightly from the ground. David watched her cautiously, ready to assist if needed. She didn't speak immediately, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corners of her lips, something that had eluded her before. For a moment, there was no language between them, just shared understanding. Then, with a quiet but steady voice, Nissa spoke, her accent strange but clear. "Thank you," she said, her words breaking the silence like a soft melody, unexpected and sincere. David, surprised by the emotion in her voice, nodded, unsure of what to say. "It's nothing," he replied softly, his own voice hoarse from the cold. "I couldn't leave you out here." Nissa studied him for a moment, her golden eyes shimmering under the rising sun. "You're different," she said quietly, as if contemplating the words before speaking them. David tilted his head, still unsure of what she meant. "How? You're human. But you're not like others I've encountered," she replied, her gaze softening. It took David a moment to realize that what she said wasn't a judgment, but a genuine observation. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. In fact, there was something like curiosity in her eyes now, something he hadn't seen before. "I don't know what you mean," David admitted, feeling a mix of confusion and relief. "I've just done what anyone would do in my place." She looked away briefly, her gaze scanning the horizon as if she could still sense the danger lurking in the vast, snow-covered wilderness. "Not everyone would have stayed," she said. Her words hung in the air, and David felt a surge of emotion he didn't quite understand. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the sense of isolation that had grown between them, but in that moment, he felt a deep connection. "I'm not leaving," he said, the conviction in his voice surprising even him. Nissa turned her head to look at him again, her eyes wide, as if searching for something in his face. For a long moment, they only looked at each other, the world around them forgotten. Slowly, she nodded, and David realized that in some strange, unspoken way, they had both made a promise to each other. A promise to survive this harsh world, together. As the days passed, the storm's remnants faded into the quiet of the morning, leaving behind a landscape blanketed in thick, soft snow. David and Nissa remained in their makeshift shelter, the walls of jagged rock offering a fragile defense against the elements outside. Inside, the temperature was tolerable, and though the world beyond still held its icy grip, there was a growing sense of calm between them. David found himself spending more time tending to Nissa, not out of obligation, but because of the deep sense of responsibility that had developed between them. Every morning, he would gather what little food they had left, scavenging the nearby terrain. Nissa, though still weak, would watch him with a quiet curiosity. Despite the distance of two very different worlds between them, she no longer seemed like a foreign presence to him. He began to realize that in this isolated place, their survival was bound together, and it was becoming more than just a matter of staying alive. It was about connection. Nissa had recovered enough to move about more freely, though still unsteady on her feet. She often leaned against the rock wall for support, her hands occasionally trembling as she reached out for balance. David kept a watchful eye on her, but he saw her strength, both physical and emotional, growing day by day. It was as if the storm had tested her in ways she hadn't expected, but she was adapting. One afternoon, as they sat together inside the shelter, Nissa broke the silence. "How did you survive on your world?" she asked, her voice soft but sincere. David paused, caught off guard by the question. "It wasn't easy," he said, leaning back against the rock wall. "But like this, you do what you have to do to survive. It's about learning how to adapt to the world around you, no matter how hard it is." Nissa nodded, her golden eyes reflecting something deeper. "On my planet," she began, her words slow and deliberate, "we are taught to rely on our strength. But strength, it isn't just physical. It's mental, too." David studied her carefully, noticing the subtle way she hesitated before speaking. "I've learned that over the years," he replied. "But sometimes, it's the smallest moments, the simplest choices, that require the most strength." Nissa seemed to ponder this for a moment. Then she looked at him, her gaze softening. "Maybe I've been too focused on the wrong kind of strength," she murmured. David felt a warmth spread through him at her words, a quiet understanding settling. Between them, in that moment, there was no alien, no human, just two individuals who had found a way to endure together. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky shifted to hues of purple and pink, Nissa made a simple gesture that left David speechless. She reached for his hand, her touch light but purposeful, and held it for a moment before releasing it. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in its simplicity, it spoke volumes. In that brief touch, David felt a bond form between them, stronger than the cold wind that still howled outside their shelter. For the first time since the storm had brought them together, David realized that their journey, whatever it might be, had shifted. It was no longer just about survival. It was about something more, something deeper that neither of them had anticipated. And as the stars began to emerge in the vast expanse above, David looked at Nissa, his heart a little lighter than it had been the day before. They were no longer strangers, no longer bound only by circumstance. There was a quiet trust between them now, something neither of them could fully explain, but something they both felt undeniably. And for the first time, David allowed himself to believe that there was hope for them both, not just to survive, but to thrive in this strange, frozen world they had found themselves in. The days blended into one another, the quiet of the snow-covered world providing little but time for reflection. David and Nissa had settled into a rhythm, their once strained existence slowly transforming into something almost comfortable. The cold was still ever present, gnawing at them, but the storm that had once threatened to tear them apart had passed, and in its wake, a new kind of bond had formed. David found himself looking out at the endless white expanse with a renewed sense of purpose. His focus was no longer solely on survival, but on Nissa as well. He had learned much about her since that first night they had spent together in the shelter. She had told him stories of her people, of distant stars and civilizations that stretched far beyond the cold, barren world they now occupied. But for all her tales of strength and power, there was an undeniable vulnerability in her that David had come to understand. In the quiet moments when she thought he wasn't looking, there was a sadness in her eyes, something that spoke of loss far deeper than the physical injuries she had sustained. It was as if the storm had cracked open something within her that she had been hiding for years. On the morning of the fourth day, the sun rose slowly, its light casting a soft glow over the landscape. The world outside was still and untouched, the storm's fury a distant memory. David rose early, his body stiff from the cold, and went about preparing the small meal they had left. When he turned to check on Nissa, he found her standing by the entrance of their shelter, her back to him, gazing out at the horizon. Her posture was relaxed, but her shoulders were tense, as if she were bracing for something. She was still weak, though stronger than before. Her once delicate movements had grown steadier, more purposeful. "What are you thinking about?" David asked softly, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace between them. Nissa turned to look at him, her golden eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "I'm thinking about what happens next," she said, her voice steady but filled with a depth that made David pause. "What happens when the storm is gone, when we leave this place behind?" David considered her words for a moment, the weight of them settling on him. He had been focused on the present, on keeping them both alive, on finding shelter, on the simple tasks that each day brought. But Nissa was right. This place could not be their home forever. They would have to leave eventually, but the unknown of what came next was a daunting thought. "We take it one day at a time," he replied finally. "We're alive. That's what matters." Nissa nodded, but David could see the uncertainty in her expression. "But for how long?" she asked. "How long can we survive in a place like this?" David didn't have an answer. He wished he did, but all he could offer was the truth. They didn't know. "I don't know," he admitted, stepping closer to her. "But we'll figure it out. Together." The words felt strange coming from him, yet they felt right. Something had changed between them in the last few days. They were no longer just two survivors in a hostile world. There was something more. Something that went beyond the simple act of surviving. They were a team now, bound together by the storm, by the cold, by the quiet moments they shared. Nissa turned back to the horizon, her gaze softening. "Together," she repeated quietly. David stood beside her, their shoulders brushing, both of them staring into the vast emptiness before them. The cold was still there, biting at their skin, but it didn't feel as harsh anymore. In that moment, with Nissa beside him, David realized that he wasn't as alone as he had once thought. The storm had passed, and though the future was uncertain, there was something comforting in the idea that they would face it together. The days grew warmer, the snow melting slowly under the increasing strength of the sun. The once bleak, frozen landscape that had surrounded them now seemed less hostile, though still unforgiving. David and Nissa had adapted to the change in season, finding new ways to survive in this alien world. They had managed to salvage a few resources from the shelter, including a small, makeshift stove that provided heat and warmth for the long evenings. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them alive. As Nissa regained more strength, she began to take on a more active role in their survival. She used her heightened senses to help track food and water sources, and her alien physiology seemed to give her an advantage in the harsh environment. David marveled at her abilities, something he would have never expected from someone so different from himself. One afternoon, as they walked together through a valley that stretched beyond their shelter, Nissa stopped and turned to him. "David," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you said, the idea of taking it one day at a time. But there has to be more than that, doesn't there? We can't just survive here forever. Eventually, we'll need to leave, find something more." David stopped walking, glancing at her. Her expression was thoughtful, a rare vulnerability that had become familiar to him over the past days. "I know," he said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "But for now, we have to focus on today. We can't change the future if we're not here to face it. It's not easy, I know, but it's all we can do." Nissa nodded, her gaze turning back to the snow-covered landscape. "I understand. But what if we could do more? What if we could find others? What if there's a way off this planet?" David felt his heart skip a beat at the thought. The possibility of escaping this frozen world, of finding a way back to civilization, seemed too far-fetched to believe. But Nissa's words stirred something deep inside him, a small spark of hope that had been buried under layers of survival instincts and loneliness. "What if there is?" he asked softly, more to himself than to her. They stood there for a moment, the wind whispering across the valley, and David realized that Nissa's question had struck at something larger than just their immediate survival. It was about hope, the hope that there was more to their existence than just this desolate place. It was about finding something to live for beyond mere survival. Nissa turned to face him, her eyes reflecting a glimmer of that hope. "We can start by looking. There must be more to this world than what we've seen so far." David couldn't deny the conviction in her voice. He knew she was right. They had been so focused on surviving that they had stopped dreaming of anything beyond it. The idea of seeking out something more, something greater, filled him with a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in weeks. He took a deep breath, the air colder than he would have liked, but it cleared his mind. "All right," he said, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "We'll start looking. Together." From that moment on, there was a shift between them. The uncertainty that had once clouded their days was replaced with a sense of direction. Together, they would seek out whatever lay beyond their small shelter, whatever world might still be out there waiting for them. As they continued their journey, side by side, David felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. No matter how impossible the odds, no matter how cold the world around them, they would face it together, and that made all the difference. The days that followed were a blend of quiet determination and careful planning. David and Nissa moved across the frozen landscape, each step a testament to their growing resolve. They had made their decision to search for something beyond survival, to seek a future that wasn't confined to the walls of their shelter. The journey was long, and each day presented new challenges. The terrain was harsh, the snow thick and unrelenting, but David found a new strength in the rhythm of their shared effort. Nissa, too, had become more than just the alien he had first found stranded in the storm. Her resilience had become a guiding force for them both. She had an innate understanding of the land, a connection to the world around them that David couldn't quite explain. It was as if her alien nature gave her an edge, allowing her to navigate the harsh environment with ease, while David's human limitations sometimes slowed their progress. But they had learned to complement each other, to rely on the strengths they each brought to the journey. One morning, as the sun began to rise, casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground, Nissa stopped and pointed toward the horizon. "Over there," she said, her voice steady. David followed her gaze, squinting against the light. In the distance, a faint outline of something appeared through the haze of the cold. It was not much, just a shape against the stark landscape, but it was enough to spark hope in David's chest. "What is it?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. Nissa didn't answer immediately. She merely studied the shape with a look of quiet certainty. "A settlement," she said after a moment. "I can feel it." David felt a surge of excitement rush through him. They had been traveling for days, uncertain of where they were heading, but the idea of finding others, finding civilization, was a possibility they had only dreamed of. He adjusted the pack on his shoulders and looked at Nissa. "Do you think we can make it?" Nissa gave him a small, confident smile. "I think we can." The two of them began their journey toward the distant settlement, their pace quickening with the promise of something more. As they walked, David couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of excitement and fear. What would they find there? Was it truly a settlement, or just another mirage in the endless wilderness? They had faced so many uncertainties already, but now, with every step, the possibility of something better seemed more real. The landscape began to shift as they moved forward. The snow thinned out, giving way to patches of bare earth. And the air grew warmer, the biting cold of the storm now a distant memory. It was a welcome change, but David couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking towards something important, something that would change everything for them. Hours passed, and the settlement slowly took shape before their eyes. The buildings were small, constructed from materials that seemed to blend with the environment, almost as if they had grown out of the land itself. It was nothing like the cities David had known back on Earth, but there was something undeniably inviting about it. As they drew closer, Nissa's steps faltered. David glanced at her, noticing the tension in her posture. "What is it?" he asked. Nissa hesitated, her golden eyes scanning the settlement ahead. "I don't know," she said softly, "but something doesn't feel right." David frowned but didn't say anything. They had come this far, and turning back now wasn't an option. Together, they continued forward, each step a quiet determination to face whatever came next. They had no idea what awaited them, but they were ready to face it, together. As they approached the settlement, the sense of unease that had gripped Nissa began to grow within David as well. The buildings, though humble, seemed too quiet. There were no sounds of life, no movement at the windows or doors. It was as if the place had been abandoned long ago. The closer they got, the more David's heart began to race. What had they walked into? Nissa's hand brushed against his, and he looked down at her. Her expression was serious, her eyes narrowed as she scanned the area. "Something is wrong," she murmured under her breath, barely loud enough for him to hear. David nodded, his own instincts telling him the same. They had come so far, but this place, this settlement, did not feel like a safe haven. It felt like a trap. Still, there was no turning back now. "We need to see what's inside," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the apprehension that gnawed at him. Together, they stepped forward, the crunch of their boots on the dirt and snow the only sound breaking the eerie silence. As they crossed into the settlement, the atmosphere grew thicker, heavier. The buildings around them were made from rough-hewn stone and metal, blending seamlessly into the rocky landscape. Despite the apparent age of the structures, they looked solid, almost permanent. But there was something about the way they loomed over them, as if they were waiting. The first building they approached was a small, rectangular structure with a rusted metal door. Nissa reached for the handle, but David stopped her. "Wait," he whispered. "Let me check first." He pushed the door open cautiously, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air inside was thick, stale, as if the place had been shut up for years. Dust lay thick on the floor, undisturbed by any recent movement. There were no signs of life. David's heart sank. "It's empty," he said, his voice low. "But what happened to everyone?" Nissa didn't answer. She stepped past him and into the building, her movements cautious but purposeful. She glanced around, then moved toward the far corner, where a large, round table sat. On it was a series of maps, some old and frayed, others surprisingly well-maintained. She traced her fingers over the maps, her eyes scanning them quickly. "These are navigation charts," she said, more to herself than to David. "They're for the whole region." David walked up beside her, his gaze falling on the detailed maps. They covered vast areas of the planet, marked with locations David didn't recognize. Some of the places were circled in red, others marked with strange symbols. "Do you recognize any of this?" he asked. Nissa paused, her expression hardening. "I do," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "These are places of importance to my people. Military outposts, research facilities. But," she trailed off, her fingers hovering over a particular spot on the map. "This one, it's not just a location, it's a warning." David frowned. "A warning?" Nissa nodded, her face clouded with thought. It's marked for evacuation. There was something there that made it dangerous. Something that shouldn't have been left behind. David's stomach tightened. What do you think it is? Nissa looked at him, her golden eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. I don't know, but I think we need to find out. If it's connected to what's happened here, it might explain why no one is left. David looked around the empty building, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. They had come here looking for answers, but now, the questions seemed to be growing, expanding in every direction. Whatever had happened to this place, to these people, was more complicated and more dangerous than they could have imagined. Without another word, he turned back toward the door, ready to face whatever came next. Nissa followed closely behind, her gaze fixed on the maps one last time before she turned to follow him. We'll figure this out, David said, more to reassure himself than her. Together, she gave a small nod, the weight of their unspoken promise hanging in the air between them. They didn't know what was waiting for them, but they were ready to face it together, no matter what. The silence of the settlement pressed in on them as they walked out, but this time, it didn't feel as oppressive. It felt like the calm before a storm, and they were both determined to weather it, side by side. As they left the building, the weight of Nissa's words hung heavy in the air between them. The settlement was still eerily quiet, but now there was a sense of urgency in their steps. David couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them, something bigger than they had anticipated. They walked toward the edge of the settlement, where the faint outline of the map had indicated a nearby facility. It was a small structure, tucked away at the farthest corner of the settlement, just beyond the remnants of a crumbled wall. The path to it was overgrown with thick vines, the earth beneath their feet soft and uneven. This is it, Nissa said, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. This is where it all started. David's heart pounded in his chest as they drew closer. The building loomed ahead, its windows dark and vacant. The air felt heavier here, thick with a sense of abandonment. What exactly happened here? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nissa's eyes were fixed on the building. My people were conducting experiments here. Dangerous ones. Things went wrong. That's why it was marked for evacuation. But they didn't leave in time. David looked at her, his brow furrowed. What kind of experiments? Nissa hesitated, her expression darkening. I don't know all the details, but it was about something they discovered here, on this planet. Something powerful. They reached the entrance of the building, and David hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. It creaked loudly, its hinges protesting the movement as they stepped inside. The room was dim, the air stale and musty. Dust covered everything, the tables and chairs left in disarray, as if the people who had been here had fled in a hurry. It felt wrong. The silence was thick, oppressive. Do you feel that? Nissa asked, her voice barely audible. David nodded, his eyes scanning the room. There was a strange energy in the air, a pulse that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It was faint, but it was there, tugging at the edges of his mind. What is it? He asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. Nissa stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. It's the power source, the one my people were studying. She moved to a panel on the far wall and pressed a few buttons. The display flickered to life, revealing a set of coordinates. They were looking for it. This is what brought them here. David's heart skipped a beat. What is it, Nissa? What are they trying to find? She turned to face him, her golden eyes meeting his with an intensity he hadn't seen before. The heart of the planet, she said quietly. The source of all its energy. If they unlocked it, they could control everything. David took a step back, his mind racing. But why was it marked for evacuation? Nissa closed her eyes for a moment, her expression pained. Because when they found it, they didn't understand it. They unleashed something they couldn't control. A chill ran down David's spine. What did they unleash? Nissa opened her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. Something ancient. Something that shouldn't have been disturbed. David felt the weight of her words sink in, a sense of dread washing over him. Whatever it was that had been unleashed, it was still here, still waiting. The air felt colder now, the pulse in the room growing stronger, as if it had sensed their presence. David turned to Nissa, his voice firm. We need to get out of here. Now. But Nissa didn't move. She stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the display in front of her, her face pale. We can't leave, she said, her voice trembling. Not yet. I have to stop it. I have to stop what they started. David felt his heart race. Stop it. How? We don't even know what it is. Nissa turned to him, her expression resolute. I know. But I can feel it. It's calling to me. I have to do this. Without another word, she moved toward the center of the room, her movements slow but determined. David hesitated for a moment, his mind torn between the need to run and the pull of Nissa's determination. But in the end, he knew he couldn't leave her alone in this place. Not now. I'm with you, he said, his voice steady. Nissa gave him a brief nod, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes before she turned back to the power source. Together, they stood in the heart of the building, facing whatever lay ahead. They didn't know what it was or what it meant, but one thing was certain. They couldn't turn back now. The journey had led them here, and now they would face whatever came next. Together, the air in the room seemed to thrum with a strange energy, a pulse that was growing stronger with each passing second. Nissa stood at the center of the room, her eyes fixed on the display in front of her. The coordinates on the screen flickered, the power source drawing her in, calling to her in a way she couldn't explain. David watched her closely, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew she was determined, but he also knew they were treading dangerous ground. The atmosphere in the room felt different now, almost charged, as if the building itself was alive, reacting to their presence. Nissa, David said, his voice steady but filled with concern. Are you sure we should be doing this? We don't even know what we're dealing with. Nissa didn't look at him, her focus unwavering. I have to stop it, she whispered, more to herself than to him. This is bigger than us, David. I can feel it, deep inside. If I don't do something, it will consume everything. David felt a chill run through him at her words. He had never seen her like this, so driven, so resolute. But there was fear in her voice too, a fear that wasn't just about the unknown, but something more personal, something she wasn't telling him. What happens if we don't stop it? He asked, stepping closer, trying to understand the gravity of the situation. Nissa turned her head slightly, just enough for her golden eyes to meet his. It's not just about us, she said, her voice low and heavy. It's about the entire planet. The power they've unlocked, it's not something we can control. It will destroy everything. I can feel it in the core of my being. This is my responsibility. I was sent here for a reason. David took a deep breath, his mind racing. He didn't fully understand everything she was saying, but one thing was clear. Nissa was willing to sacrifice herself to stop whatever had been set in motion. And that terrified him. You don't have to do this alone, he said, his voice soft but firm. I'm with you. We'll figure this out together. Whatever it takes. Nissa gave him a small, grateful smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. I'm not sure you're ready for this, David, she said quietly. This power, it's not something you can just fight off. It's ancient. It's in the very fabric of this world. It's part of me. David's heart skipped a beat. He stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out, instinctively wanting to connect, to reassure her. Then let me help you, he said, his voice earnest. I may not understand it all, but I'm not going to let you face this alone. We've come this far together. I won't leave your side now. Nissa seemed to pause at his words, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge his resolve. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the tension between them palpable. Finally, she nodded, a flicker of something softer passing across her features. Together, she whispered. The room seemed to shift as Nissa stepped forward, her hands moving swiftly over the control panel, activating the sequence that would trigger the next phase of their plan. David stood by her side, his heart racing as the air around them grew warmer, the pulse of energy intensifying. He didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if they were about to make a terrible mistake or if they were on the brink of something extraordinary. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, and it was because of her, because of Nissa. The energy in the room seemed to come alive, swirling around them as Nissa's hands worked the controls. The lights flickered, and the hum of machinery grew louder, vibrating in David's chest. This is it, Nissa said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hold on. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, and David could feel the air growing thick with power. A low rumble echoed through the walls, and for a moment, he thought the whole building was going to collapse. But then, everything stopped. The room fell silent, the hum of energy dissipating into the air. Nissa stood still, her expression one of focused intensity, as if she were listening for something in the silence. David held his breath, waiting for the next move. Finally, Nissa spoke, her voice steady but filled with awe. "It's done," she said. "We've stopped it. For now." David exhaled, his body relaxing for the first time in what felt like days. But as he looked at Nissa, he realized that their journey was far from over. This was just the beginning of something bigger, something that neither of them fully understood yet. And as they stood together, in the heart of the building that had once held so much fear, David knew one thing for certain. They would face whatever came next, side by side.